Well, first of all, I want to say muchas gracias. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here at this fine institution. Just walking in and looking at some of the pictures on the hallways and meeting some of the members is a very humbling experience, and it's a real honor to be here. So thank you for inviting me, and I'm glad that we have such beautiful weather in Argentina. I understand it's a very nice spring day, so I don't want to keep any of you inside here much longer than necessary so you can enjoy some of the weather. But I wanted to start off actually by maybe saying a little bit of a joke. I don't know if many of the diplomats here have served in Egypt or have been, but they know that Egyptians have a very good sense of humor, and humor was a very important tool in the revolution. So, and it really cuts to one of the main themes of what we are witnessing in the Arab world. And the joke goes something like this. I hope it's not lost in the translation, but President Mubarak passes away and he goes to heaven, or wherever he goes, but he goes somewhere. And he sees before him President Sadat and President Nasser, the predecessors. And he says to them, they're looking and they're having a discussion, and President Sadat goes, "What happened to you? Did you die from a heart attack, or were you assassinated?" And President Mubarak says, "No, I was Facebooked." And I know this may be, a little bit of a casual joke, but in essence it cuts to one of the main principles of the revolutions that we are seeing in the Arab world, which I personally believe in. These are the first revolutions that we are seeing in the information age, in the modern information age. And information has played an incredible role in mobilizing the people, in the people being able to connect with one another, and in reality, spreading this wave of change and the winds of change that are taking place across the Arab world. On December 17th, in a small Tunisian village, a young vegetable seller who had become very disenfranchised with his life set himself on fire in the city of Sidi Abu Zaid. And I don't think anybody here had ever heard of the village of Sidi Abu Zaid. I mean, I certainly have never heard of it. Maybe there's a few who had. But in essence, really nobody knew anything about this small village. And in reality, it was this individual's act of self-emulation that angered the residents, that their life had become so bad that they took to the streets that evening and they essentially protested outside the governor's office, and the security forces were deployed, and that was the beginning of the Arab awakening, if you will. But what was really interesting wasn't that the protest happened, because protests have been taking place in the Middle East. What was really interesting is that evening, the cousins of Mohammed Bouazizi, the man who set himself on fire, went home after filming the protests on their cell phones and uploaded the video onto YouTube. And that night, they created a Facebook page for their cousin who had died, with this video of the protesters of Sidi Abu Zaid uprising against the governor's office. And what happened was the next morning, the people in the nearby villages woke up, heard about it, but when they turned on the Tunisian news and looked online in the newspapers and the print newspapers, there was absolutely no mention of this story whatsoever. And it was that evening that Al Jazeera saw the YouTube video and posted the YouTube video saying that this was video that had been essentially taken place in the city of Sidi Abu Zaid. And why this is such an important example, because shortly after the Tunisian Revolution began, the people in Egypt started saying, well, if they protested in Tunisia, why can't we do it in Egypt? And so a young Egyptian woman went on Facebook and created a video post calling on the Egyptians to go to the streets on January the 25th and protest on the National Day of Police. It was the day that on January 25th is the National Day of Police. It's a national holiday in Egypt. And many people thought this was absolutely, impossible to happen. Egyptians for many years had been completely, frustrated, completely immobilized. There was no chance that they were going to go to the streets. And the calls for these protests got louder and louder, and on January 25th, I think everyone in this room knows what happened. And the security forces completely were overwhelmed 3 days later, and the military was deployed, and 18 days later, President Mubarak stepped down. So when I talk about the role of information, I think one of the most important things that I always note is that information played a role in breaking the fear factor And if there was anything that allowed or continues to allow these regimes to exist in the Arab world today, it is the fear factor that the states have over their citizens. And this is the fundamental relationship that is now changing, is that the power of information is making citizens feel empowered. They are able to see beyond their borders. They are able to hear and understand what is happening. And most importantly, they are drawing inspiration from one another by their very actions. The people in Yemen saw what happened in Egypt and protested. The people in Syria saw what happened in Yemen and protested. The people in Libya saw what happened in Egypt and protested. And this has been the domino effect of the Arab revolutions that we are currently seeing. To kind of narrow it down a little bit to Egypt, there were two essentially fundamental tracks that were taking place in Egypt that were extremely problematic. On one hand, there was the decline in the quality of life. There was frustration. And for years, people were chipping away at the regime, but nobody could have predicted how and in what capacity this change was going to look like. And so this was the spark and this was the catalyst that happened in Tunisia, which, regardless of what anyone will tell you, was unpredictable. Nobody knew that this was how the Arab awakenings were going to happen. The revolution in Egypt was particularly interesting for one very important reason, and that was the regime of President Hosni Mubarak for 30 years had all of the support of the world. He was an individual who was welcomed in every European capital, unlike, let's say, the leaders of Syria or perhaps even Libya. And he certainly had the backing of the United States. And despite all of this negativity that Egyptian citizens projected towards the West about America, not once during the course of the Egyptian revolutions did the Egyptians burn the American flag. Not once did any symbols of American cultural power or influence was attacked. It doesn't mean that Egyptians don't have a resentment towards the US, but there was a clear distinction that was being made. And why this is such an important point is because in some of the traveling I have done around the world since the end of the revolution and speaking to people, there is always, particularly sometimes in American media, there is a tendency to look at these revolutions with very cautious eyes. Who are these revolutionaries? Should we trust them? Is it Al-Qaeda? Are they Islamists? And in reality, I think that while they are valid questions, it really dilutes what is happening in the Arab world and closes the window of opportunity that currently exists. For the first time in a very long time, there is a sense of optimism that is passing through the Middle East. And nobody can predict what is happening because every country is very unique. What has happened in Tunisia is very different than Libya, is very different than Egypt, is very different than Yemen. And in the three countries that have had changes, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt, the outcome has been extremely different in each one. In one, the president has fled and the country in Tunisia is being run by an interim civilian government. In Egypt, the president is arrested on trial and the country is still being run by a military council that was entirely appointed by the former president. And in Libya, you had a group of rebels who overthrew an entire regime and the leader is still on the run, hiding in Libya. So when we talk about these conditions, it's very important not to generalize or make a blanket assumption across the Arab world. The Arab world is very different. Libya is much more tribal than Egypt. And Egypt is much more strategically important than, let's say, Tunisia. So each country has its own variables, and I think when countries, whether they're in Latin America, Europe, Asia, are formulating their foreign policies, they should base their policies on each individual country, but with general principles that these individuals and these revolutions are fighting for the same spirits and values and principles that people in Latin America fought for and people in the US enjoy: freedom, democracy, the pursuit of social justice. Because these were all the values and principles that in the Arab world for years have been denied. And many of you have served in the Arab world, you know firsthand that the states that are being built in some countries, even the Gulf states, that have the trappings of a modern state, it looks like a modern state, in reality deprives its citizens of the most basic fundamental elements of modernity. And so I really think that the opportunities that we have today facing the Arab world, the role of information and what of an important tool it is in shaping the public perception has fundamentally changed the relationship between the citizen and the state. It used to be that in the Arab world, the citizens were the property of the state. In essence, the state, which was ruled by these families, a handful of families, controlled all of the resources of the state and would allocate these resources in the interest of these few individuals who controlled these countries. And what we have seen in the Arab revolutions is the fundamental change in the relationship between the state and the citizen. No longer are citizens afraid of their rulers, particularly in the countries where the revolutions have started. And the message for that is that for all those who will come to govern Egypt from now on, there is always the question or the option of Tahrir Square, that the people feel they can always go back to Tahrir Square and exercise their veto over who rules them and how. That's the overarching principle. Now there's definitely some very serious problems because Egyptians are waking up to the post-hangover reality. You know, when you wake up after a hangover and you have a little bit of a headache. And Egyptians are waking up to the hangover that they now have serious issues to deal with in their country. Minority rights, the issues of Coptic Christians, women's rights, the new relationship with Israel, and what role they want Egypt to play. And these are very important questions that Egypt for 30 years hasn't dealt with in a democratic process because they were in the hands of just a few leaders in the country who spoke on behalf of the 80 million people. Today we have 80 million voices, and I promise you every Egyptian now feels that their voice should be heard. I've been in many protests. You know, if people in Egypt get a bad haircut, they go have a protest in Tahrir Square. So I can assure you that it's a new freedom that many people are enjoying, but it's also one that brings with it tremendous responsibility and opportunity. I think these are, in closing, very exciting times. And one of the things that many people over the past few days that I have been here in Argentina and elsewhere have asked is, are there any opportunities for countries in Latin America or countries such as Argentina with all of these changes in the Arab world? And I think the absolute short answer to that is yes. There's a tremendous amount of opportunity and there's a tremendous role to be played for countries in Latin America, particularly in Latin America. And I was just having a tremendous discussion with one of the members here who was telling me about the experiences of Argentina with its military and some of the changes that it's going through and went through. And in this particular case, the examples of Latin American countries can serve not as models for Egypt or Tunisia or Libya, but can certainly serve to answer some of the same questions that countries and societies dealt with. How do you restrict or change the relationship between the military and the state? How do you build institutions of your country after years of dictatorships or authoritarian regimes? So all of these questions that many countries in Latin America dealt with, they are the prime questions that Egyptians and other Arab countries are going to be facing. So I think it's a tremendous opportunity to come and speak to the Council because I really believe that it's through people-to-people dialogue, academic exchanges, exchange of journalism, that these types of answers to some of these pressing questions can certainly be answered. I'm also, very honored to be here because I worked for Al Jazeera for 5 years, and knowing that Argentina was the first Latin American country to broadcast Al Jazeera on its cable, I think speaks tremendous volumes about the Argentinian people, about their openness to the outside world. And I think this is something that's very, very important that should definitely be capitalized on in these exciting times in the Middle East.